Good evening and welcome to our annual meeting. Hopefully you enjoyed the first hour of the evening. My name is Joy Elvin, in case you don't know me. I'm the Executive Director of Sakonnet Preservation. So welcome to our 2026 annual meeting of Sakonnet Preservation. This marks our 54th year protecting the rural character and natural resources of Little Compton for the lasting benefit of the community. Thanks to conservation-minded landowners, our membership, essential funding, support and the services of literally hundreds of energetic, passionate and dedicated board and community members over all these years. Oop, went on too fast. No, there we go. So, by the numbers, behind every acre. Now, remember, this is our annual meeting and we're recapping 2025, so none of 2026 in here. So behind every acre, we have 14 board members, 2 of which are stepping down tonight, and we've got 2 new ones. They met 10 times last year, and our 5 most active standing committees are Finance, Executive, Stewardship, Land Protection, and Education and Outreach. They held 35 meetings, and that's roughly 73 governance hours, plus approximately 20 more from other subcommittees, such as the True Blood, which totals roughly 93. Volunteers, we have roughly 73, and they gave approximately 110 hours, and about an hour and a half each on property monitoring, work groups and other projects. That's on top of what the board contributes. And our team, we are 3. There's myself, Venia Booth and Adam Yorks, and we logged 4,263 hours. So board committees, subcommittees and volunteers gave a minimum of 203 hours in 2025. That's like having a coffee with a friend nearly 4 times a week, every week, all year long. We protect in perpetuity just over 488 acres across 78 parcels, each with its own management plan or baseline documentation report. Continuing with the numbers. We have 488 acres protected to date and in perpetuity, including 14.6 acres that was added in 2025. We have an average of about 400, it says acres here, over 5 years, 400 members. In 2025, we gained 52 first-time members, which is quite something in a small community. We have, again, 73 volunteers. We have 7 partner organizations, and that changes each year. And we estimated, with the help of some AI help, that we've 34,000 plus metric tons of carbon stored across our wetlands, meadow, shrub, scrub, and coastal habitats. Community, we had 60 people join us at the volunteer and landowner barbecue last year, and we hosted 10 workshops and outreach events in 2025. All of it is powered by 3 staff juggling schedules, family, sheep, the weather, and don't even begin to ask me about the countless ticks. So, not my favorite things at all. The highlight of 2025 was not an event or a workshop, but the donation of a 16.4 acre conservation easement on the west side of Little Compton by the Rawson family. A gift that represents the very best of what Sakonnet Preservation does and how we do it. Board member Sheila McIntosh worked with the Rawson family for well over a decade to make this moment possible. With patience, sensitivity, and an unwavering respect for the family's deep connection to their land, Sheila carefully nurtured the relationship over many years, never rushing, always listening. The result is this extraordinary donation, a stunning and ecologically important parcel, now protected in perpetuity. As the Rawson family wrote so beautifully on the front cover of our latest newsletter, this was a decision made with great care and great love. We are honored that they placed their trust in us, and we are proud to be the stewards of this remarkable piece of Little Compton. Education outreach is a big part of what we do. Our collaboration with the teachers and administrators at the Wilbur School continues, as does our Laurie Richmond Goodnow Young Naturalist Award. The recipient this year is on the right there. And that's presented to an 8th grader each year with an exceptional interest in the natural world. These initiatives, coupled with our newsletters, movie and speaker series, and other outreach work, reflects our commitment to keeping conservation education a core part of our mission. Stewardship is definitely at the heart of everything we do. Acquiring land is only the beginning. The true measure of land trust is not how much land it is conserved, but how faithfully it honors the promise made to care for that land forever. When a land trust conserves land, either by owning it or by holding it in conservation easement, it promises to take care of that land forever. New transactions are exciting, but it is only through consistent, capable, ongoing stewardship that land is truly conserved. That promise is one we take very seriously every single day. In 2025, our Stewardship Director, Adam Yorks, who's somewhere in here, together with a dedicated team of more than 30 property monitors, completed annual inspections of all 78 of our individual parcels. Each visit ensures that the conservation values entrusted to us by our landowners remain protected, that our trails remain safe and accessible, and that we can identify and respond to any challenges before they become problems. True conservation of the land depends on the ability we have to steward the land and to do it well. This is not routine work. This is a solemn obligation carried out with care, expertise, and extraordinary commitment, visit by visit, parcel by parcel, year after year. And now I invite Bill Terrio for the most exciting part of the evening, our treasurer, to say a few words about our finances.
Thanks, Joy. As you can see by the chart on the left, 2025 was another great year for Sakonnet preservation, largely due to three things: the generosity of the people in this room, a cooperative stock market, and a focus on expenses by our staff. What I'd really like to draw your attention to, though, is the chart on the right, because many of you remember that when we embarked on our capital campaign to create an endowment, it was with the hope that we could eventually generate enough income from those assets to cover approximately half of our operating expenses. As you can see, we're well ahead of that goal. Last year we generated $175,000 in returns on our asset base, on a lower asset base than we have today at $3.1 million. But for conservative purposes, we've only estimated a 5% return, which would be approximately $155,000. The great news is that covers 57% of our budgeted operating expenses and 65% of our 65% of our fixed operating expenses. Thank you. I should have worn my glasses. Which is pretty remarkable. If we can achieve the kind of results we have in previous years, those numbers will only be better than what's reflected here. So I'm happy to answer any questions, but I suspect you'd rather get on with the main part of the presentation. So track me down if you have something. Thanks.
And now I'm going to hand the very important part of the evening over to Abigail Brooks, our president, for the election of officers and directors.
I do have my glasses on. Okay, the following slate has been recommended by our nominating committee and supported by our board of directors for membership vote from you to fill the positions for our 26-27 officers and directors. Once again, Abigail Brooks, President, Peter Rowley, Vice President, Bill Terrio, Treasurer, and John Cook, Secretary. Directors, Paul Bozzoni, Herb Case, Davy Cutts, Nan Haffenreffer, Maureen Hayes-Harrington, Jeff Manning, Jean McAllister, Judy Melanson, and new board members Joe Minville and Kurt Peters. May I have a motion supporting the nominating committee's slate of officers and directors for the coming year? A second? Second. Any questions, comments? All in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Thank you. I'd now like to honor the board service of two retiring board members and express our gratitude for their service. Mikal Brownell served on our board for 10 years. She was recruited to join after we learned of her passion for land conservation from her husband, Bart. We also learned later that her passion was driven in part by the fact that her father had been involved with a Reading, Connecticut land trust, and she had also experienced the devastation of development on Long Island around her grandparents' home that had been part of her childhood. Pretty intensive drivers for conservation. She served as a property monitor as well as co-chair of our Education and Outreach Committee while assisting our nominating committee during her tenure. Her intelligent engagement, perspective, and humor have been meaningful contributions to the work and the congeniality of our board. She will be missed, and we are so grateful for the service she has given us. Thank you so much, Mikal. I'm going to repeat some of what you will have read in the newsletter about Sheila McIntosh's retirement, but it deserves repeating. Sheila has led our Land Protection Committee for 23 of the 26 years she has served on our board. While she's stepping down from this board, she is devoting her considerable skills to our town's planning board. Sheila's high standards of practice have profoundly influenced the quality of our work. Excuse me. She not only led all of our land protection projects during my tenure as president, but also served on our stewardship committee. This is really pathetic.
Do you want me to read it?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to read.
Okay.
Just stay there. So, as president, but also served on our stewardship committee and as the board secretary and vice president. Most importantly, she recognized the value of partnering in the challenging work of land conservation. It has been a greater privilege than Abigail can adequately, and all of us, to be honest, can express, to have been both mentored and partnered with her over the past 21 years. Landowners who have completed land transactions with us, as well as fellow board members and staff who have experienced her exemplary service, join me in thanking her for the remarkable legacy she has left on our landscape, and with this organization out of devotion to this special place we call home. Thank you, Sheila.
So what would an annual meeting be without tears from Abigail, right? It comes with a tear.
Hang on, that one's mine.
Sorry.
And before I hand it over to our guest speaker this evening, I'd like to say a few last words. 54 years is a long time, and yet in this work there is no finish line. What we do demands that we keep reaching. A land trust is constantly evolving. The land changes, and as the years pass, the rules and regulations that govern us change. We must constantly evolve, redefining, refining, and adapting to what this world presents to us. When a community of people is genuinely passionate and committed to something, as noble as the preservation of land, of landscape, of legacy, then that passion carries with it a moral obligation, a duty to be of service, to be part of the solution, and to never stop striving for something better. Conservation isn't a short game, it's a long game. And thanks to our community and all of you, we are in it for the long haul. This is the land that our children will inherit, and we intend to leave it well. That is what drives us here, our board, our staff, our volunteers, and each of you in this room. So that concludes the business portion of our meeting. May I have a motion to adjourn? Great. So we have a second already. Any discussion? No. All in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? No. Okay, thank you. Before I introduce our speaker for the second time, I've said that, I'd like to thank our board members and staff for stepping up so willingly to assist with this event. I also need to thank Clarkshire Media for taking the videography for this meeting, and unfailing help and friends of the staff of the Little Compton Community Centre, and to Wilma Bruning for the catering, and to Perky Ellison for managing the bar, all of them ensuring the success of this evening. So now I can welcome our speaker, Emily Hall, who is Coastal Geologist for the Rhode Island Coastal Resources Management Council. Emily applies the best available science to the management of Rhode Island's coastal features. She knows firsthand that our coasts are dynamic systems, and much of her work is focused on preparing coastal communities like ours for the realities of climate change. She collaborates with researchers, state and federal agencies, local nonprofits, and coastal users of all kinds to help develop policies that prioritize resilient shores. Her research explores how communities and ecosystems respond together to a changing climate. She studied marsh migration in the Chesapeake Bay, carbon and plastic sequestration in Filipino mangroves, we'll talk about that later, and sandy beach geomorphology right here in New England. Emily holds a Bachelor of Science in Geology and Environmental Science from William and Mary, and a Master's of Science in Oceanography from the URI Graduate School of Oceanography. So please, everybody, welcome Emily.
Thank you, Joy, for the lovely introduction, and to the board and everyone here for having me this evening. Before I begin, I would love a show of hands of anyone who was here for the annual meeting in 2013. So we have a few. This is great. All right, mostly new audience, though. I'll take it. Fresh ears. So when Jeff first reached out, he mentioned that in 2013, so this is right after Sandy, they had Dr. John Boothroyd, who was the Rhode Island state geologist at the time, come and do the presentation for your annual meeting. A few things have changed in the last 13 years. So this is kind of a part two to that. What has the science been up to? What have coastal policy folks been up to? And what do we know today so we can plan for tomorrow? So with that, the fun word that Joy had the pleasure of pronouncing is coastal geomorphology, we'll get into it, of Little Compton. We'll be talking about our trends, impacts, and next steps. And for today's talk, I have it broken into three large pieces here. So I'll introduce myself. Whenever I have to listen to anyone for more than 20 minutes, I'm like, why should I listen to you? Who are you? So we'll start with that. I'll introduce CRMC for those with the pleasure of not being familiar with my state agency. And then you will all be subject to what the freshmen that I occasionally teach are subject to, which is going to be Geomorphology 101, a little bit of science here. And then we'll get into the fun mapping that really guides my current work today. So why a geologist? Geology is more than just hard rocks. I am what the volcanologists of the world refer to as a soft rock geologist because I study sand and mud, rivers and coasts, and how those things move. It's kind of the abiotic side of environmental science. I know my 10 marsh plants, and beyond that, I ask the biologists. I say that is more than I need to know. So tonight's goal is going to be to understand how beaches change through time and why that might be a good thing. So a little bit from my introduction, I grew up not in New England, I'll get that out of the way. I'm from the Chesapeake Bay area originally, which you see on the top left corner of the screen. In the Chesapeake Bay, I grew up with my version of Save the Bay for a much larger bay. I was happy to see we have one up here as well. And in that area, I really got into marshes and how they respond to sea level rise. So in the lower areas of the bay, we call them kind of the floodplains, similar to here in Little Compton, we have a lot of really historic farmland. What's not similar is all of that is very low lying. So it's a lot more susceptible to sea level rise and what we call marsh migration. So in my time there, I took a lot of sediment cores. That's the mud you see in a PVC pipe on the right there. The cool thing about geology is we look at the earth through time. So as you go farther down into the earth, as you dig farther down, you get to go farther into the past. From there, I wound up coming up here to University of Rhode Island, where my master's research was funded by USAID in the west coast of the Philippines, highlighted in red there on the map on the bottom left. So I was studying carbon and microplastic sequestration in mangrove and seagrass forests. That is a very unflattering photo of me in the middle of a mangrove forest. Luckily, they didn't have ticks, but I was on anti-malarial drugs, so pros and cons. That being said, this is all marsh stuff. It's all things with vegetation. You're like, why is she going to talk about beaches, right? Well, the cool thing about geology is we're all about processes, right? Whether it's a marsh or a mangrove forest or a seagrass meadow or a beach or a dune, it's all the same underlying workings. We have our tide, we have our winds, we have our waves, and depending on the underlying soft rocks, it'll determine what that coastline looks like. So I had the pleasure of working with the Coastal Resources Center, yet another acronym, scientists are great with that, to do what we call beach erosion monitoring. So this was actually founded by Dr. John Boothroyd, who I mentioned earlier, to say, how are the beaches in southern Rhode Island changing? So they were looking at all of those barriers, about 7 sites on the southwestern shore of Rhode Island. And I went out every other week with some measurements and I said, let me walk this line over and over again, see where the sand grows and where does the sand go down. So an example of what that looks like is kind of in that black and red there. So even just in 2 weeks, you can see there's changes, right? This is a dynamic system. So that brings me to CRMC, the Coastal Resources Management Council. So we are a state agency. There's only about 30 of us. We're small but mighty. And our legislative charge is to preserve, protect, develop, and where possible, restore the coastal resources of the state for this and succeeding generations. I put this up here because there's some things that I hope will resonate a lot with this group. Obviously, the preserve and the succeeding generations. I think I heard those mentioned in your annual meeting just now. But then there's some things that we think might be a little contradictory. What do you mean develop the shore, right? So CRMC, we are not an environmental organization, I would say. We're a state organization. And our goal is to balance all of these. We do the management. How do we do that management? With a really long regulatory text. All of the activities within our jurisdiction, so that is 200 feet inland and 3 miles offshore, are based on their water type and coastal feature. So this covers everything from installing an offshore wind farm to replacing the shingles on grandma's cottage. Needs some kind of authorization through our office, and we make sure that it is in alignment with all of the goals for our coastal feature. So I'm living in North Kingstown. I don't think I can say I'm from there yet, but this is Wickford Harbor and an example of our water types. So when our agency was founded in the 70s, we said, what are all of the existing uses of water right now? And we classified all of it on a scale of 1 to 6. 1 is conservation area. So we said, this is ecologically sound, it is important, there are species of recognition, it is a beautiful place, any and all of those things, right? We say that is for conservation only. And then it runs all the way up to 6 for industrial use. So here we have a little corner of Quonset, right, where it makes sense of, okay, maybe you can have some industrial stuff there. The other major type 6 areas are Providence Port, right? But the vast majority of our coastlines are actually type 1 and type 2. Here in Sakonnet and Point and Little Compton, which we're a little more familiar with, that dark blue you can see is all type 1 water. So the vast majority of the areas are held for conservation, essentially. And that governs all of the allowable activities that we say you can and cannot do in a coastal zone. The exception of that is, of course, the Sakonnet River. And that bright green is type 2. That's why my drive over here was so pretty, seeing all the boats moored in that area. So in type 1, you can't have a dock. In type 2, you can. Little things like that. When I was reaching out and I said, what are the folks here going to be interested in tonight? 2 beaches kind of came up. South Shore Beach, which we have on the top right, the northeast, and Lloyd's Beach over here on the west. So both of these are type 1 waters, right, held for conservation, but they are different coastal features. So in South Shore Beach, we have a developed barrier. That's going to be the majority of our talk tonight is what is a barrier? How does it move? And then at Lloyd's, we have a coastal headland. So again, we start to see these geologic coastal features. They're different underlying things, and that's going to inform the management goals. It's going to inform the regulations, all of that fun stuff. So this is the crash course in CRMC. When it comes to beaches, those two main pieces for type 1 beaches, when we talk about restore, develop, preserve, protect, it really comes forward as preserving and protecting as being our main goals. So we're only going to allow an activity if it can meet all of these criteria. We want to preserve public access on beaches adjacent to type 1 water. So that is a constitutional right we have here in Rhode Island. We want to prevent activities that'll disrupt sediment transport. That's my bread and butter. Prevent construction in high hazard areas, and protect scenic and ecological value. So this will be the rest of the talk tonight is about how do we know what longshore transport is? What are the beach processes? How do we make sure we're preserving these things that are inherently dynamic? That brings us to Geomorphology 101. If we break down the word, geo meaning earth, morph meaning the form or structure, and ology, the study of. So we're going to walk through each of these pieces and how it applies to Rhode Island, and specifically our little corner here in the southeast portion of the state. I am a geologist, which means we have to talk a little bit about deep time. I could have gone back the whole 4.6 billion years, but we'll start at 20,000. So in the last glacial maximum, is what we call it, it was at its largest extent about 20,000 years ago. The ice sheet extended to that dotted blue line you can see on the map on the right, and it was up to a mile thick of ice, which is insane to think about. Sea levels at that point, because all the water was trapped in the ice, were about 120 meters lower than where they are today. Right, so this is the scale we're talking of. Interestingly, although it's not on this map, unfortunately, you'll see that extent of the ice sheet, it lines up perfectly with Long Island, Block Island, Martha's Vineyard, and Nantucket. So all of those islands were essentially these glacial fronts at the end of the ice sheet. You could think of it as a big bulldozer, pushes everything out, kind of scrapes everything up, and then that little line was where the ice sheet ended. Geology matters. 18,000 years ago, it wasn't just one quick warming, but the warming did start to outpace the cooling. So we saw gradual retreats and then gradual advancement over that 2,000 to 5,000 year period. So at about 18,000 years ago, the melting was beating out the freezing, and this held for several years. And this formed what we call the Charlestown Moraine. So this, if you are driving around, I think I have it in here. Yep, there we go. So on the bottom left there is Route 1, and it follows the Charlestown Moraine exactly. Because again, it's a mini version of building those islands, of you scrape all the sediment, you scrape all the rocks, and you have a really high point. And then if you're going between the URI main campus and the oceanography campus where I worked, you go down a really big hill, right? Because you're leaving the glacial moraine and you're going into the glacial sediment deposits. So that's all that this fancy graph on the right is showing here. Essentially, we had that first glacial front and then everything retreated. And now we're left in a weird glacially strewn landscape that has formed everything we see today. So about 11,000 years ago, the glaciers kind of finished their retreat to the poles. And then, of course, we had the beginning of agriculture a few thousand years later. All of these things are connected. Sea levels became pretty stable, and we were able to see barrier islands form. On the scale of geologic time, these barriers are ephemeral. They last a few thousand years, perhaps, but we are lucky to be in the same time as them. So here in Little Compton, we have several that kind of front those coastal ponds. I've also got a photo of the stone walls up here. I saw a pamphlet downstairs about all of the stone walls in Little Compton. I love that you guys included the new mapping product that came out. It's a massive effort. But those two are a product of our glacial history, right? As the glaciers were retreating, they weren't just dropping massive boulders, they were also dropping little ones, right? And then when we had colonization and agriculture, you're plowing your fields, you're picking up glacial erratic, glacial till, and piling it at the edges of your property. So next time you're walking by your stone wall, you can thank the glaciers for the wonderful feature. So now we get into the morph part of geomorphology. This is going to be an anatomy lesson, but in geology terms. So here in Little Compton, I mentioned we have about 8 coastal ponds with associated barriers for each of them. So all of those small little strips of land are what were essentially just welded barrier islands. So the one I've blown up here is Briggs Marsh, which I hope we're familiar with. And we're going to go blowing in even more. So geologists and scientists in general, we love to classify things. When we classify things, we can study them, we can talk about them, we can compare them. So this is the anatomy of a barrier, and you'll see this on the Little Compton barriers. You'll see this at Narragansett Town Beach. You'll see it in the Outer Banks of North Carolina. Every barrier is going to have all of these basic components. So on the innermost section, we have a lagoon. Here in Rhode Island, you might call it a coastal pond or a salt pond. Some are brackish, some are fresh. A lot are a mix. Here in Little Compton, you have some that will connect with the ocean, some that I think never have connected to the ocean, but all a lagoon of some sort. And then next in our little sequence here, we have a marsh. So we'll have a low marsh and a high marsh system generally, and these are still generally tidally influenced. And then we have our beautiful dune system. This tends to be the topographic high point. So the tallest point that you can be on the barrier will be at the very top of the dune. And then we have our wonderful beach, that we all like to be on. And then our swash zone where the waves are actually active. So now that we have our wonderful classification system, we can start comparing things, right? So one of the first things I like to introduce to students, at least, is thinking about energy. Beaches, coastlines, all of these things are nature's response to dissipating all of the energy that comes in off of the ocean, right? Hundreds and hundreds of miles of wave energy, wind energy. It all needs to go somewhere. And the coastal system is nature's response to that. So generally, on the lagoonal side of a barrier, it'll be a much lower energy system, right? That's where our salt marshes are. In the top right here, we have salt marsh sparrows, which are an endangered species here in Rhode Island. These sparrows make their nests at the border between the low marsh and the high marsh grasses. And so they're very susceptible to small increments in changes of water level. But they can build here because generally it is a low energy system. They're not going to be disturbed by waves. They're not going to be disturbed by storms. This is a protected area. And the ecosystem around it has evolved to thrive in that protected, low energy system. As we move out towards the ocean, that energy gets higher and higher. So when we think about a beach and a swash zone, I want us to think of this as a high energy system. This is an area that is changing quickly. You think about a wave crashing, it's changing on that magnitude of seconds, right? And we can see that reflected in the ecology of a beach. Right? Because it's a higher energy system, you can't have grasses that want to root there, right? We don't have salt marsh sparrows making their nests. We do have piping plovers, but that's an exception to the rule, I think. But we do have things like horseshoe crabs, right? And even looking at the ecology of the critters that call a high energy system their home versus the critters that call a low energy system their home, you can start to see these patterns that are forming. When we think about energy, we can also start to think about time, right? Because geology is Earth through time. So how are we going to connect these two? In our lagoonal system, another way of thinking of it is occasional disturbances, low energy disturbances. So on the right here, we have a salt marsh at high tide and low tide, right? It's nice and gentle. It rises every 6 hours. It falls every 6 hours. And then as we move out, we have higher energy and frequent disturbances, right? So those big waves crashing every few seconds is a lot more of a disturbance than a tide gently rolling in and rolling out. And again, we're linking structure to function to time, how the Earth system is changing through time. So when we think about how these disturbances can be seen in the landscape, we can start to map on temporal scales of when do we expect to see these changes? How frequent should these changes be? What does it look like for a dynamic system to be somewhat stable, right? So in our lagoon, in a happy world, we'd expect to see changes kind of on the scale of hundreds of years. You're not going to see changes in a lagoonal edge that often. And then in your marsh, maybe tens of years. Every time you get a hurricane, perhaps you get a washover fan, things change. On dunes, we see more frequent disturbances. Every winter, they look different, right, year to year. Beaches obviously look different in the seasons within a year. And then you get into the swash zone, and you can see changes on weeks all the way to days and seconds. Here's those fun coastal hazards now mapped onto where do we expect them to impact these parts of a barrier. So we've got sea level rise in that tens of years kind of category, hurricanes, nor'easters, winter storms, spring tides, and then our daily tides, right? So all of these forces working together, working through time, slowly changing these parts of the landscape. I don't know why that box is there. We continue. Oh, I know why I was there. Because I was going to highlight sea level rise and hurricanes and nor'easters as the three kind of big things people are always curious about. So we'll start with our seasonal change. I'm sure everyone's heard about erosion. I think erosion sometimes gets a bad rap. It is simply sand moving. So if I can have you guys take anything out of here, it's that erosion's not evil, right? It's not meaning that sand is disappearing. It's just the movement of sand. So a way to think about it in a barrier system is that erosion is sand moving out of the system. It's moving out towards the ocean. So the main seasonal change that we see, and people who live in Rhode Island year round will see this, is your winter beach is very, very different from what your summer beach looks like, right? If you go walking on the beach in winter, you might have maybe 2 feet to walk on between high tide and the dune, versus in summer, all of a sudden there's plenty of space for everyone's towels and umbrellas and the weird tents that everyone's putting up these days. So in our winter, when we have larger storms, we have erosion, the scary word. But all that's happening is the waves are washing in and they're taking away some of the sand from the dune and from the berm, from the beach area, and they're washing it out to a sandbar. That sand hasn't evaporated. It hasn't disappeared. It's just moved to the near shore system. Anyone who likes to surf or swim knows that when you go out to one bar break on one day, it'll be in a completely different position the next day, right? It's dynamic. Waves are slowly moving that sandbar. And as that sandbar moves, it can slowly weld back in with the beach. That's how our beach builds in the summer. So we can see that bar moving in and creating that wonderful berm again for all of our umbrellas and sand. What it looks like in reality is this, right? So that top image is from the Narrow River right after the winter storms of 23-24. You can see we've had a big chunk taken out of the dunes. It looks scary, right? But that sand didn't disappear. It just went into that near shore zone. Here, a little bit of it went into the Narrow River as well, which is a whole other thing we could talk about if folks have questions. But then those sandbars slowly moved their way in until we got what we call a ridge and runnel system. That's that middle image there. If you go to the beach in March through May, generally, you'll see a lot of these. When I was a kid, my parents loved putting me down in the little pond on the inner side, right? Because it's protected from the waves. But that is just a exposed sandbar, essentially, that's moved its way out of the water onto the beach. And then it slowly moves its way in, and then eventually the wind can pick it up. And then this is what the Narrow River looks like a year later, right? So you still kind of have that scary scarp, that scary cliff that formed. But even in the span of a year, we start to see that sand reaccumulating at the base of that exposed dune. It's dynamic, sand is moving. I do have bad news though. I lied a little bit earlier. Sometimes the sand does leave entirely. So when you have bigger waves, you can think of it as more energy. That sand doesn't necessarily stay in the near shore. Maybe it gets dragged way offshore. So in this case, if it gets dragged beyond what we call the closure depth, which is where waves can interact with the bottom. So typically that's 10 to 30 feet deep, depending on how shallow or steep your coast is. That could be 10 feet offshore, could be a mile offshore, right? But generally 10 to 30 feet deep is where the sand goes, nope, we're out of here. We're not going to come back as a sandbar next summer. So it can leave the near shore system, and that sand will likely never come back to the beach unless, of course, sea level starts falling again. So that's some of the erosion that's scary, but there is accretion as well at this larger scale. When sand leaves the system towards the ocean, sometimes it also enters the system farther into the lagoon. So this is Quanticottag Barrier over in Westerly and Charlestown. This is right before Sandy. So that's not a quiz, it's a review, but we can see all of our wonderful anatomy of a barrier here. We've got our coastal salt pond. We have our low marsh where you see those little mini ponds kind of popping up. We've got that back barrier area, the dune, and then the wonderful beach. What happens if you have a wave that's so big that it doesn't take a bite out of the front of the dune, but it overtops the dune entirely? This happens. This is called a washover fan. We're great at naming things. The sand washes up and over the dune and essentially moves the sand into a new part of the system, right? This is part of that barrier rollover, barrier expansion processes. So we have some sand moving out seasonally and moving in seasonally. And then we have some sand moving out on the scale of years, right? When we get really big storms, and moving in on the scale of years when we get these really big storms. Over time, this barrier complex does tend to migrate inland. So we have more and more bites being taken out of the ocean side, and we have more and more washover happening on the lagoonal side. So we slowly see it roll over. So this is right next to Sakonnet Point that you can see. And again, on the top, we have before Sandy, and then after we have after Sandy, right? You all don't have quite as much erosion here, you're lucky, but you do still see rollover happening, right? With these washover fans that are gonna slowly move that entire beach and barrier system a little bit further inland. There we go, that's the photo I wanted. Of course, barrier rollover will happen as long as we allow it to move. So this is a photo of Matunuck in that area. This is the South Kingstown Town Beach. I'm standing on the beach and looking at what we call a hardened shoreline. So that's a bunch of riprap. So by putting in some kind of structural protection, you may preserve the upland uses, but you have frozen that shore in place. There is now no more sand to erode, nor is there sand to roll up and over and make new barrier. So while the beach itself is moving inland, that part is frozen, and they now no longer have any beach because they've essentially frozen it in place. So in our 101, we hopefully know why the Southern Rhode Island looks like it does, because glaciers are a very powerful force. We know why a barrier looks the way it does. It's all determined by the energy of the system and the frequency of the disturbances. We know how it can respond through time, right, on the scale of minutes and hours to seasons and years. And we know that the movement of the barrier itself allows it to survive. How does this help us understand what may be vulnerable to coastal hazards going forward? We have the body of the system. How does this move? How do we interact with it? What is it going to look like in the years to come? So the main three I'll be focusing on this evening are sea level rise, coastal erosion, and marsh migration. I hope this is a friendly audience for this. Great, the chuckle is good. In the last 50 years, the empirical data shows that we have seen 7 inches of sea level rise. So this is a graph from NOAA, and I'll explain a couple of the lines here because I think they're really interesting. In yellow on the very right, we have altimetry. That's a fancy word for saying elevation measured by satellites. In green, we have tide gauges. And then in black, we have the trajectory of the smoothed out curve. And in blue, we have the exact reconstruction of what all the tide gauges and altimetry say. The important things here is altimetry matches tide gauges. So if we look at our 2 data sources today, we say our satellites are definitely correct. This is high tech. We know they're correct. And because they're correct, they can then let us trust the tide gauges even more because those methods haven't changed through time. So if we know the methods match today and everything looks good, we can trust the tide gauges then, as long as the methods have been the same, going back hundreds of years, depending on where the harbor was, who was measuring it, and whatnot. So we have this great cache of data to really reconstruct this. The second piece, of course, is the upward trending black line. We see that increasing, and we see it increasing at a faster rate than it has previously. Since we have all of that historic information, we can then start to say, what is it going to look like tomorrow? A lot of scientists who are smarter than I have put in a lot of time looking at probability curves, but for the purposes of planning, as a state agency focused on preservation, development, conservation, we want people to be safe, right? We want construction to be safe. We say, we're going to use the high scenario. If you plan for the worst scenario, you'll be safe when the okay scenario happens. So under that high scenario, they expect just over 6 feet by 2100. So that's compared to 2000, I believe. So quite a bit. On the right there, as a scientist, I think this is fun. We don't need to dive into all of it now, but I'm happy to take questions, is all of the components of why sea level is rising. So sometimes people think it's all the ice sheets or it's all of the glaciers that are melting, but the largest piece there is blue. That is the stereodynamic sea level. If we think back to, maybe chemistry 101, physics 101, temperature is just an indicator of how quickly molecules are vibrating, right? So if you increase the temperature just a little bit, all of the molecules in water start vibrating a little bit more. And if they're all vibrating a little bit more, they all have a little bit of more space between them. If you amplify that across the world's oceans, that's a lot more space between them. And that's what that sea level, that stereodynamic level is just the thermal expansion of the oceans themselves. I was surprised by that. Sea level rise, of course, does not work alone. It also affects wave action. So if sea levels are higher, waves can attack further inland. So that means more movement of sand in via washover fans and more movement of sand out via getting pushed beyond that closure depth. And again, if we're remembering time scales and we're thinking about, can the beach recover in the summer after its winter storms? The worry is if we have more storms that are more severe, the beach doesn't have time to catch its breath. There's not time for those sandbars to form. There's not time for them to make those nice ridge and runnel formations. There's not time for them to recreate the dunes. So system doesn't have time to catch its breath. We've got our erosion and our washover fans. FEMA is a great collaborator agency of ours, but they are unfortunately tasked with doing the entirety of the United States when it comes to flood planning. I've just spent the last 30-something minutes talking about how beaches are dynamic. FEMA flood predictions, however, assume that the structure of the shore is static. This makes a lot of sense if you are an organization trying to do all of the United States and you're just focused on safety, right? But it makes less sense when so much of Rhode Island is so varied with its coastal geology, its geography, its existing uses. So we developed a tool after Superstorm Sandy. We said the FEMA flood maps aren't enough. We know beaches move. We know that dunes are going to respond with the erosion in front and the washover fans in back. So if all of that happens, where does the water then actually go? So we've developed maps to show what different storm scenarios look like and what those storm scenarios look like under different levels of sea level rise. So if you want, you can go online and you can say, I know what Sandy did in 2012. What is it going to do if it hits in 2050 with another foot of sea level rise? They've done all of the modeling and mapping, and I'd encourage you to go check it out. Another piece that we did after Sandy was doing a statewide inventory of how bad is erosion really. So luckily we have aerial images going all the way back to 1939, and some poor grad student sat there and clicked on a map to draw all of those shorelines, and we then have a great time series. So this is an example from the Harbor of Refuge in Galilee. So we've got 1939 in red, and then going out to 2014. This shoreline's moved a lot because it's right next to a breakwater and a breachway, so it's a little funky, but it shows the example well of, if we have all of these lines, we can determine a rate of change. And of course, those erosion rates change depending on the geology and the incoming energy. A point of interest, for example, is here at Sakonnet Point. This poor PDF was so grainy, but I tried my best. So I pulled out the important pieces here. So the Sakonnet headland, so Lloyd's Beach, that erosion is only about half a foot a year. So if we think all the way back to the beginning, I said we had headlands and we had barriers. This is a pretty stable one, right? This is not something that's trying to roll over. It's just trying to persist. The state average for erosion for a benchmark is about 2.4 feet per year. So you're doing pretty good. And then on our barriers, however, where it is trying to roll over, where it is more responsive, we do see that increase. That number is supposed to say 1.0 feet per year. You'll have to take my word on it or go and zoom in on these terrible PDFs if you're interested. So we've talked a lot about the scary things, but there are some good things about a changing dynamic system. So there is an opportunity for marshes, which I think the folks here are hopefully interested in. This is what we call SLAM maps. Again, we love our acronyms. So sea level affecting marsh migration maps. I think there's 3 M's in the acronym technically. So this is an inventory of where the marshes are today. So everything in maroon there is a happy marsh today. And then if we run those storm tool scenarios and we say, where is the flooding going to be? What is the storm disturbance going to be? How are the barriers themselves going to move and erode? We can make a prediction on where marshes might want to be tomorrow. So in yellow here, we have persistent marsh. So that is marsh that is marsh today, will be marsh tomorrow under this 5-foot sea level rise model. Of course, the exciting part for me is the brown one, is predicted marsh zone. Marshes are great. They store a ton of carbon very quickly. They help with accretion. They provide crucial habitat. And here in Sakonnet, you have much more brown area than you do purple, which is the potential marsh loss zone, right? So with this barrier rollover, with this movement of sediment, yes, some habitats are being destroyed and changed, but more habitats are being created, right? It's this balance of, again, how do you preserve a dynamic system? We've been talking a lot about ecology and sand, my favorite, but of course the human component matters perhaps more than anything. We know that changes to landscape affect communities. One of the missions of CRMC is to preserve public access. So one of our ongoing grants is with Rhode Island Sea Grant. Again, the acronyms, it's CC, Sustained Access to Rhode Island's Coast in a Changing Climate. So what they're doing with that is they're taking all of those storm tools maps and they're putting it on top of all of our public access points. And they're saying which of these are going to become marsh and maybe people can't walk on them, which are going to be flooded, which are going to be eroded, and which ones should we intervene with? How do we intervene with them? So it's a massive inventory. I believe they just started last year, but it's headed up by URI and the EPA. They're doing a great job so far. Another great tool that I always recommend for civilian scientists is Rhode Island My Coast. So they have 3 different ways to take photos. You can do a storm report, a king tide, or a coast snap. This photo on the bottom right, I had to include something from Dr. Boothroyd. So this was actually a My Coast photo that he took and uploaded. You can still go and see from, what is that? 2011. So this is a community initiative to say when there's flooding in your community, go take a photo. You upload it to this website. It puts a drop dot on the map. And then because it has the timestamp on it, we can say, what was the tide at that time? Where were the incoming winds? Was there a storm in the area? So we're essentially creating a massive database of what does flooding look like and where are the problem spots? Where are the parking lots? Where are the boat launches? All of those pieces. I know, it's a lot of things. One of the things that I work with the most kind of puts all of these tools together. You know, this is that's a lot. How do I keep track of it? This is a requirement for some applicants, essentially anyone who wants to build a structure. But I encourage anyone to do it if they're just interested. We call it the Coastal Hazard Application, and it takes all of those maps and jargon and it walks you through step by step to say what level of risk is going to be assumed over the design life of the structure. Look at the tides. Look at if it's impacting your access roads. Look at the erosion, right? Look at the structural damage risk effects. And it essentially holds your hand through all of this science and modeling to say, what is it going to look like, in the future? And I never like to leave presentations on a doom and gloom note. So I do want to mention that there are active adaptation measures that are happening, right? I believe that one of the ways to preserve dynamic features is to preserve the process, if not the structure. So by preserving the processes of sediment being able to move in and out, by preserving the process of beach grass being able to colonize through its rhizomal structure, right, we can create a system that is going to outlast all of us. So natural or nature-based measures tends to be our number one recommendation, and it's the only type of protection we allow on type 1 waters, which is where we started all of this. This is my rant against structural shoreline protection. So in our management program, we have concluded that they are typically undersized or underdesigned for the risks of today. They have negative impacts on adjacent beaches, on the natural environment, and on public access. So although it's tempting when you see all the scary things to say, let's freeze it in place, we know enough now that we know that this is going to have more long-term consequences than it will benefits. This is an example of nature-based solutions that TNC is currently pursuing at a few different spots. I don't think at Lloyd's yet, but beach nourishment is a very popular one that I know people have questions on, so happy to discuss it. But again, this is about preserving process. If the sediment wants to move, but some of sediment is out in a closure depth and we're not going to get it back, you can bring in sediment that matches, reintroduce it to the system, manually rebuild that sandbar, and we can help things last a little bit longer. So, in conclusion on our hazards, the shore will respond dynamically as sea level rises. This can be a good thing, but we have to use the tools available to us to make the proper plans for it. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions. I don't bite. And if you're too nervous to ask a question, I'm sure, oh, okay, we got a few. Yes.
Thank you very much. Very thorough. You sound like a professor. I'm thinking about Lloyd's Beach and West Island. There are places where a hunk of rock, I don't know whether it's an erratic or not, basically keeps something fairly stable, which is Lloyd's Beach. And do we see that sort of as we go down or go east along the shore, that there are structures that basically enable the sand to stay fairly stable?
So the question for folks who couldn't hear is at Lloyd's, we have a couple hunks of rock and protrusions and whatnot that seem to have stabilized things. And the sand is stable, it's happy there. Do we see that continuing kind of down towards the east of the area? We see it a lot more between the barriers than on the barriers themselves. So some of those barriers are bedrock. So I'm not as familiar with Lloyd's, unfortunately. So I could be making the wrong assumptions here. But some are bedrock. So think like Jamestown, Connecticut Point, that is all exposed bedrock. And then in between barriers, we tend to have glacial erratics and glacial till. So you'll see larger stones. Those tend to erode not as quickly in most areas. And sometimes they can act as a little mini breakwater, right? So they can stop the wave energy early as if it's an immobile sandbar almost, which then creates a lower energy environment behind it. But unfortunately, I don't know enough about Lloyd's specifically. Yeah. Yes, one second.
Are there issues with the beach replenishment? I know in New Jersey they've been just like, Army Corps of Engineers will like spend 3 months putting all this in, and the first northeaster just brings it all back out again. It's like ridiculous waste of money.
Yeah.
And also, it seems like you're basically taking the sand from the far out sandbars and bringing it back in and not letting nature do its own job. So then there isn't. It's sort of
it's a
like
tricky problem.
Be improved. It seems like it's counterproductive.
Okay, so I'll tackle a couple of pieces of that. So question is, beach nourishment, is it counterproductive, right? If we're talking about nature-based solutions, it seems like perhaps of an overreach and an over-intervention. So in New Jersey and along Long Island and North Carolina, those tend to be the biggest Army Corps projects. A lot of the reason for that is because there's a large tourist industry in those areas. They're much more developed than the Rhode Island coast. You have hotels, you have highways. At that point, they've said the public benefits of an intervention outweighs any of the risks. In Rhode Island, we already have beach nourishment happening. So the town of Charlestown, for example, if anyone heard about the Charlestown Breachway reconstruction, this was a beach nourishment project, essentially. A lot of sand got sucked into Ninigret Pond, so it essentially left the barrier system. And they said it's never going to naturally rejoin the barrier. So we're going to take that sand and we'll put it back on in front. So that's one example. In North Carolina, as far as where do they get the sand from, I mentioned the closure depth, right? Where that sand is only going to come back in if sea levels start to fall. Typically, they only take sand from beyond the closure depth, where they say there's no chance of it becoming a sandbar again. It's just a deposit out there. That's where it comes from. And then that tends to be beyond state waters. So the Bureau of Ocean Energy and Management, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and NOAA Fisheries all do consistency reviews to say, are there animals there? Are there endangered species? What are the impacts going to look like? And all of that gets caught up in the Army Corps review. So typically, for a well-permitted project, you're not stealing from a spot that would naturally replenish the beach. It's something that's already beyond the closure depth. And then this is something I struggle with folks on, especially when they do dune planting projects, right? You see this problem of if whether or not it's a $3 million beach nourishment project or it's a $10,000 dune nourishment project for one person's house. I put this in this spring and I planted, you said it would work. We have our first nor'easter, everything is gone. And I say, I hear your frustration, but the flip side is maybe it did its job, right? So those storm waves are washing away that sand that you put there artificially instead of what would have been behind it, right? So instead of perhaps the more healthy dune behind these New Jersey and Outer Banks sites here in Rhode Island, I'm more concerned about the house, right? So I'd rather your sand that you put in wash away than the pilings underneath your house. And then hopefully some of that sand doesn't leave the system entirely. Some of it may go beyond the closure depth, but hopefully some of it gets caught up in the sandbar. And from a permitting perspective, I say, well, it may not help you, but it'll help your neighbor in about 3 years. So be my guest. Does that help a bit?
In areas like New Jersey and New York, where stuff has just been dumped out there for 100 years, you're digging up all this sediment and sand and sending it back up to the coast from a half mile out, and it's all contaminated.
That's yet another issue. Yeah. So even in Rhode Island, we have spots where we put contaminated sand underwater and we cap it and we say, hopefully that's good enough to hold. So multifaceted for sure. Yes.
I'm basically an islander.
Okay.
My childhood was in Anna Maria Island, Gulf side of Florida. And then for 40 years, in my mid-years, I lived in Brigantine, New Jersey. And they did coastal restoration. Mm-hmm. They brought in one of my favorite cats, Caterpillar tractor, 972 NXE. And they brought in 20-foot long sections or longer of 2 foot in diameter steel pipe endlessly. And in the north end of the island, which is 8 miles long roughly, the north mile or so is protected, and then the rest of it is up for grabs. Mm-hmm. And then you have Absecon Inlet and Langston. The north, you've got Brigantine Inlet and Long Beach Island. And off Long Beach Island, out there in a shoal area, which is a graveyard of ships, they anchored a barge and they started pumping. And they pumped, and they pumped, and they would shoot sand up from the bottom and dump it along the beach. and the cats would come in and pick it up, and they'd move it. And they would keep doing this all the way down that mile. And then another half mile or so onto Brigantine City proper. And it was amazing. There was a place called the Castle. And the castle was built on an old mom and pop fishing pier, which was really what it should have been all the time. And they put this thing up, which was a great navigation point. If you were sailing offshore, you could pick that off like miles out to sea. This thing was, I don't know how many hundred yards offshore, a couple of 100 miles off the beach line. And it went down into the water and kept on going. The beach itself went out, maybe 100 feet and then, or more, and then gradually sloped down into the water and went on out the end of the pier. And they started, and they moved sand, and, you know, in the beginning, you used to surf off that, and you take a longboard, put it off the seawall, and you just put the tail of the longboard down, and then climb down off the seawall, and take your board and go on out and surf. When they got finished, the berm on that beach was higher than the seawall. You get down, hunker down, look across that beach, and it was level. It sloped a little bit towards the seawall, came up and went out. It went out to the end of the pier. And you get to the end of where the pier used to be, and it would drop off. So the waves were shot. In a couple of years, there was a storm that came down, nor'easter. The hurricanes were bad. The nor'easters were amazing. And just sort of hung on. It took that sand, and it moved that sand south so far that when you go to that same place, you go to that seawall and look over the side, and it would drop down 7 feet. It just took it and moved it. And in Anna Maria, they decided they were going to build up those beautiful sugar sand beaches. And they went offshore and they started pumping in sand. And that sand was Paleolithic. The sand, it was. Paleolithic. Marl. It had fragments of animals that lived in it. You know, megalodon. The sharks, big sharks. We had big sharks to begin with on that.
Do you have a question?
Yes. The question is just an observation.
I think it's a lovely observation.
That water, the water that came up was turquoise blue, blue-green, but you couldn't see through.
So
It was so fine. And it's, my comment here involves what we face on this planet when we mess with it. We have to back off.
So I think this is one of those dialogues that's great between a management agency, right, and a preservation, right? It's like, where do we find these middle grounds, right? Where does it make sense? Where does it not make sense? So what you were describing sounds like a hydraulic dredge system. So that's that big pipe, right, where you kind of pull up a slurry and then you deposit the slurry. And it sounds like they were doing, at that time, just moving sand on the subaerial beach, so everything that's dry. If we look at our nice little diagram here, if you just build that berm really high, right, that's 7 to 10 feet, sometimes you mess with the slope of it so much that it starts acting almost like a seawall, right? When I was talking about when you have that vertical structure, it can't respond well to the waves. You'll have waves bounce right off of it. And sometimes if you make it too steep, right, you can see increased erosion, you'll see increased movement, increased dynamics. So in an ideal world, I never have a nourishment project that just builds plus 10 feet on the subaerial beach. I have a nourishment project that says, we're going to build plus 2 feet from the dune, through the berm, through the swash zone, down to the sandbar, right? Saying we're going to nourish this whole system, right? Rather than just packing it all on one end. I will say we've learned a lot. I will say Rhode Island as well, I think, is several years from even entertaining a serious proposal for wide-scale beach nourishment. I know myself and the agency still have some concerns over where does the sand come from? How are we doing the quality assurance? I was on a legislative commission for the House 2 years ago, 1 year ago, time kind of blurs, that looked at this problem and said, should we consider wide-scale beach nourishment or putting in breakwaters? Surfers would not be happy, right? Or should we consider doing more offshore kelp farming to try to break up the waves? So some areas like Misquamicut and Westerly, very interested in that because it's more industrialized, more tourists, right? And then in our areas where we have more conservation, much less interested, right? We say, maybe we let it be dynamic. Maybe we just see what happens. So it's an evolving thing. If you feel passionate about it, call your local legislator, would be my advice on that end. I don't want to keep everyone here, but I'm happy to keep chatting.
I think we'll go one more question.
Okay. And then you can find me after if it's pressing.
How is all this funded?
Oh, that's a good question. How is all of it funded? So we are public, so you can find our information. About 2/3 of our funding is from the state legislature. And then 1/3 is from NOAA. So we are a coastal zone management agency. So we report directly to NOAA at the federal level. And that NOAA funding goes for staff time as well as project time. And then state funding is only for staff time. When it comes to external projects, I have to apply for grants just like you guys. So to do the beach SAMP, for example, with the coastal hazards analysis worksheet and all of that storm tools mapping, a lot of it was partnerships with URI. And they were able to apply for funding through DOD, Rhode Island Emergency Management Authority, different external agencies like that.
What's this year's budget?
I don't know. That's above my pay grade. If it's quick, we can do one at the front, and otherwise you can find me after or send me an email. Yes?
You've talked about, in type 1 areas, you've talked about barrier beaches and marshes, but not developed land. And what is the logic of including them together? Because they have very different characteristics, they erode differently, and there are houses on the developed area. And what is the logic for that? I've never understood that.
So the question is, how do we balance type 1 conservation when inland development could not match with that water type itself? And why we include lots of like beaches and marshes, which are very different, but then also things like developed land. Did I kind of capture that enough? Okay. We can just chat after. Water type is just one piece of the equation. The other piece is coastal feature. And then the final piece is the activity. All three of those things come together in a wide matrix to say, what are we going to allow in this area to make sure all three of those things are safe and stable for the system and have no adverse impacts to their neighbors. So when it comes to type 1 water, that's a classification for the water and the water alone. And it does govern some things that can and cannot happen on the adjacent coastal features. But even within that, there are exceptions. So for example, there are man-made shorelines that are adjacent to type 1 water. So Naval Station Newport, for example, is a man-made shoreline adjacent to type 1 water, where we say, you know what, you've done so much man-made stuff, we've made an exception for you, you can continue to do those alterations. So there are some things within the program where we can find the variances. I hope that helps a little bit.